Hi class, we have a brief lecture for you here on Chapter 13. This begins our coverage of supply chain topics in the class. This particular chapter is titled Supply Chain Management. So let's jump into it. So the chapter really has four learning objectives. The first is just simply an overview of factors and competitiveness for a supply chain. And then we look at supply management, we look at order fulfillment, and we look at managing the customer interface, customer relationship management. So what makes a supply chain competitive? And it has to do with essentially three areas that we really want to effectively align. And so one of those areas is the uh, ability to handle competitive pressures by aligning external and external expectations and needs with internal resources. One key aspect of that is ability to deal with dynamic sales volumes. So recently with the tariffs that have been announced, we're experiencing some dynamism in volumes that we might not have expected in 2024. If we're, let's say, if we're at the end of 25 and we're thinking about what's happened in the last year, in 2024, we didn't expect all of this. So that's one aspect, being able to deal with variation in sales volume. It doesn't have to be related to tariffs. Obviously, there are a lot of sources of variation in terms of sales volumes. Second aspect that we have to somehow align our ability with our customers' expectations is what's the level of customer service? What are the quality expectations? We probably can't satisfy the universe of potential customer service and quality expectations. So we have to identify what our configuration is going to be. We have to be careful about not getting spread too thin. And so we need to decide where does our product portfolio end. And we don't want to let our, uh, we don't want to say yes when we ought to be saying no to customer requests for products or services that really aren't in our wheelhouse. And dealing with emerging markets, we might choose to pursue a supplier in a country that we haven't had expertise or prior relationship, prior experience in dealing with that country. And similarly, we might have potential customer markets in new countries where we don't have that know-how and knowledge that's necessary to be effective. So these are some aspects of aligning our internal capabilities with external realities that will influence competitiveness. So the picture kind of expresses that deal, what we have in terms of service and product, and what we have in terms of supplier capabilities, customer requirements, and what we have in terms of internal processes and capabilities, they all come together to create a reality. And to the extent we can have those three things effectively aligned, we can be more competitive with our supply chain. If we align them further, we have greater areas of potential effectiveness and competitiveness. You can imagine moving these three circles, the centers of the circles closer together, and you could see that there would be potential for greater effectiveness. There'd be more shaded area in this scenario. It's just an illustration, but it's talking about the need to align uh, our resources with external realities in the supply chain and with the uh, range of product and service that we offer. This picture is a fairly common one. Oftentimes we see this when we're talking about supply chains. It was first used to describe the U.S. auto industry. And so Ford, GM, Toyota, they would be manufacturers. Uh, OEMs, we might say, original equipment manufacturers. And in this industry, it's been common to talk about tier one, tier two, and tier three suppliers. So tier one suppliers, for example, for the auto industry might provide major systems like anti-lock braking system from Bosch or an interior from Johnson Controls, something of that nature. So those tier one suppliers often are uh, providing major sub-assemblies. Uh, they probably are buying from tier two suppliers components. So Bosch is probably buying chips from for the anti-lock braking system from some other supplier. Similarly, Johnson Controls might be buying seat frames from some particular supplier. And then finally, the tier two suppliers are probably buying commodity type raw materials. So in tier three, you might have an aluminum smelter, a steel manufacturer, a company that makes fabric. And so what they're creating is more or less standardized products, probably making to stock and selling to the tier two supplier that then uses those raw materials to make components, which then go into major sub-assemblies and into the product that we manufacture. So when we're thinking about tier one, tier two, tier three, we're thinking about the upstream supply chain. It's pretty common for manufacturers, large manufacturers, to work heavily with their tier one suppliers and expect that those tier one suppliers to cascade on back down through the supply chain certain expectations with regard to how processes are managed and what quality will be and so forth. Oftentimes, a new management technique will make its way through the supply chain in that way. It's also not uncommon for really large manufacturers, let's say Stellantis, to have a relationship with tier three suppliers that says, okay, we have all of these component manufacturers that are buying parts from you, but they're buying them for something we're going to make. And so we're going to negotiate the price that they get. So that's kind of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about upstream. Downstream, generally in the auto industry, you would have distributors and retailers. If you bought a Toyota recently, you might have gotten it financed from Southeast Toyota, which distributes Toyotas in the southeast of the United States, and then you probably bought it from some dealer or retailer. It's pretty common for a manufacturing supply chain to have this sort of a look, particularly if we're talking about durable products where there's a real mass market and the manufacturer, the OEM, has a lot of power in the supply chain. Supply chains in other industries are going to look different. So, for example, in a healthcare situation, most likely the hospitals and or doctors' offices and so on have a really diverse set of product suppliers for the parts that they buy, and the expertise that they need is in-house. They may have some sort of a supplier for, uh, let's say, overflow capacity or weekend capacity or things of that nature. But generally, most of the supply chain is internal, and that's where most of the value comes from. And it's important, of course, in the end to make sure that you have the materials that you need when you need to treat a patient. So some aspect of inventory management could be pretty important in the healthcare supply chain. Generally, when we think about what our supply chain is today, it has some ability to perform. and it costs us a certain amount of money. So that's what the axes of this uh, supply chain efficiency diagram are. So supply chain performance on the horizontal axis, total cost on the vertical axis, and the blue line here really represents the best we can be with what we have today. So if we want to be more competitive, in the way this picture is describing it, we need to either reduce costs or improve performance until we get to the frontier that we can reach today. So generally, when we think about supply chain management, we're thinking about doing everything we can today with what we have, what's in place, who our suppliers are, what our product mix is, what our processes are, and so forth, in order to make them better and closer to as good as they could be, that blue line, the performance frontier. But then long term, we want to maybe get better suppliers or help our suppliers improve or improve our processes or think more effectively about our product mix. So we may want to or be able to expand the frontier beyond where we are. This is kind of a conceptual picture, but it's helpful for us to think about improvement of supply chains. Uh, there are things we can do today, there are things we can't do today that we would like to be able to do tomorrow. And so do what we can today to approach the frontier and do what we can to expand the frontier for tomorrow. So we're kind of done with the first learning objective, kind of talked about competitiveness. The next area that we want to address in this chapter is supply management or supplier management. And we'll be talking about things like sourcing, which is where do we get what we get, design collaboration, which is our strategy about determining the characteristics of what we're buying, negotiation, which has to do with how we relate to our suppliers, buying, which has to do with the actual approach to transactions, and we'll talk a little bit about vendor managed inventories as well. First off, sourcing. So when we talk about sourcing, basically we're talking about selecting suppliers. That is, we've got to decide who it is that we're going to buy the things that we buy from. And then we might think about what's the relationship with the supplier going to be. So we may have programs that we establish in order to certify our suppliers and evaluate our suppliers. So for example, if I'm Toyota and I'm buying electronic components from my suppliers, I really would like to know that when those components show up, that they're ready for me to put on the car. And if I don't have trust and confidence in my supplier, I'm probably going to do something different with that part I bought. I'm probably going to inspect it and make sure it's working and have some work to do before I can use it. But if I've got a certified supplier, then I can just go ahead and use the part and I don't have to deal with those things. So if I have an effective certification system, it can really help me in terms of the relationship with the supplier. Excuse me. And so what I'm going to do with my suppliers is I'm going to evaluate their performance even if they're certified. So I buy the part, I put it on the car, we find out that it's defective when we're testing the car, or when we have a warranty claim, and so that'll be part of the evaluation of the supplier. Other things that we might include in the evaluation would be on-time performance, how much lead time do they require from us? What types of improvements have they made? Have they had any cost reductions? Have they had any particular improvements in process capability that they've told us about? So these are things that we'll use in our relationship with our supplier. Finally, we have to get into the day-to-day management of supply contracts as well. So if I have a certified supplier, that supplier has a contract, then I have to ensure that the supplier's paid for the volume that we've purchased, that they've delivered, and the way that we've requested the part to be delivered, and so on and so forth. So management of the supply contracts is kind of the accounting that shows up in the relationship. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, it's not just cost that we're interacting with the supplier on, but we're interested in the supplier's performance in a variety of areas. What's the quality of the materials they're using, as mentioned here on this slide. Timeliness, are they delivering on time? Are their lead times short enough to work with our planning processes? Uh, what market segments can they help us with? And we would hate for our suppliers to be unethical or polluting in ways that just is not good. Uh, from an environmental perspective, and ultimately would also not be good from a PR perspective. So when we're looking at suppliers and our relationship, maybe selecting a supplier or uh, thinking about moving to a new supplier, we might use, especially since many of these criteria are relevant, we might use something like a preference matrix to help think about the decisions that we need to make in terms of suppliers. This is an example of a preference matrix. The criterion that are identified here are total cost, on-time delivery, consistent quality, and environment. And it looks like we're talking about suppliers in Belfast, Hong Kong, and Shreveport. Ultimately, to make this beneficial to us, we have to come up with a way of evaluating supplier performance or likely performance on these criteria. So you'll notice here that Shreveport seems to be best based on the way we evaluate total cost. Uh, Belfast seems to be best in terms of the way we evaluate on-time delivery. Hong Kong seems to be best in terms of the way we evaluate quality. So the process of putting together a preference matrix like this requires us to have a way of measuring performance on these criterion. And it has value whether we come up with a number and a result. It has value because of forcing us to come up with that measurement. And then also because it enables us to think about, okay, how important is performance on that measurement to us? It looks like environmental performance is less important in this hypothetical scenario, and in fact, only half as important as on-time delivery. So thinking about those things is something that helps us to make a decision. We can get a weighted score, which is what this example in the book does. Multiply the weights by the scores, and we'll come up with a total for each location. That's okay, and the location with the highest score may be the one we go with, but it doesn't have to be. It's the process of thinking through this which could help us to make a decision. In fact, it could even help us to think about our relationship with the supplier that we select. So, for example, it turns out Belfast is pretty good on everything except total cost, and we could use that in working with that supplier. We could say, we will do business with you, but you have to work on cost, or maybe we will do business with you if your cost performance moves in this particular way. So a second aspect of working with suppliers that potentially we could get involved with is design collaboration. So it might be possible for a large manufacturer, let's say a GM, to design every part that goes into their automobiles. But you might ask the question, why? Why should General Motors be designing audio systems? Or maybe why should General Motors be designing, let's just say the the chemical characteristics of the paint that they use on their cars. Doesn't make much sense at all. And so when we think about designing items that are going to be sold to a large market, particularly if we're talking about complex items, makes a lot of sense to get involved with suppliers early and use a collaborative design process. So we might do something like pre-sourcing. We might say to uh, Bosch, we believe for this new automobile that we're designing, we're going to need a new anti-lock braking system, or we're going to need a new LiDAR system for our cruise controls. And we're thinking about you, and would you be interested? And there may be an alternative supplier that we come to with the same sort of idea. And in the end, we may decide, okay, you're the one. That's what we might call pre-sourcing. By selecting them early, then we can uh, be more assured that they're willing to contribute their best to our design. And in an early stage, and knowing what we'll know about the braking system, for example, might enable us to uh, have more confidence about our decisions on for example, the total weight that we can make the vehicle or something of that nature. So pre-sourcing can be very helpful. And generally, the result of having this capability will be that we have a total package that fits together more effectively and utilizes world-class knowledge in all of the component areas. So when it's all said and done, we should be delivering something that has great value. So value analysis is an effort to take cost out of a product while still improving it. And a lot of times we can do that through collaborative design processes. Next process that your book looks at is negotiation. Uh, in the supply chain literature, a lot of times we contrast competitive and cooperative orientations when thinking about negotiation. So the competitive orientation is where we, as a buyer and a seller, sort of try to divide up the potential profit in the supply chain. We're viewing it as a zero-sum game. In this scenario, essentially, a supplier may become or may be dependent on the buyer and have to take the price that they're given. Or a buyer may be somewhat dependent on a supplier and have to take the bid that they're given. And so, in a competitive scenario, you're going to be working to come up with the best price you can get in this process. Usually, most of the negotiations are on price, but there could be negotiations on other aspects of the value that's being transacted in the relationship. If you have a competitive orientation, the terms of the deal really come down in large measure to how you exert power in your relationship with your supplier. There are a number of different types of power or sources of power you might have in a relationship. One type is called referent power. So, it might be that a supplier would like to be able to tell other potential customers, hey, I've been working with IBM, or hey, I've been working with Amazon, and so we've got this great relationship, and the ability to uh, or the value of that referent power is something that you could leverage in a negotiation. Expert power has to do with knowledge and information, maybe skills that a supplier or a customer might have. So, for example, Amazon probably isn't real good at collections the way that American Express and Visa and MasterCard are in terms of collections. So if they want a branded credit card, they're probably negotiating with a company, financial company that has that type of expertise. The company with the expertise can exert that power in terms of dictating the terms of the relationship. Reward is what it sounds like. Oftentimes, a buyer has the ability to give rewards to suppliers. Sometimes suppliers have the ability to give rewards to buyers. So, for example, a reward might be a financial reward, but it could be, for example, Amazon and a potential supplier. It could be in the algorithm and how the product gets placed on the website, how it shows up in searches and things of that nature. Legal power oftentimes comes from maybe patents or contract law, things of that nature, and can be a very, very definitive source of power in supply relationships. If I've got a patent and you want what I have, then I've got a lot of power. Coercive power has more to do with the ability to punish the entity you're bargaining with. And so, for example, a, uh, a buyer might decide or might threaten uh, other relation, other things that are exchanged in the relationship. So, you know, we want to buy this from you. We want this price, but if you don't give us this price, we're going to think twice or three times about this other thing that we're buying from you. So that would be coercive power. It's not always the buyer that has the power. And so that's really what negotiation's about in a competitive orientation. Contrast with the competitive orientation is a cooperative orientation. And so here we're more in a situation where the buyer and the seller see that working together they can do better than they could if they were competing for the whatever it is that's available in terms of benefits in the supply chain. In a way, you could, Chrysler used to use the term extended enterprise, and they'd say the Chrysler extended enterprise competes with the extended enterprise of other auto manufacturers. And so we want our whole supply chain to be better, which means we want our suppliers to be better. We want to do what we can to invest in them and make them more effective. Sole sourcing goes along with this cooperative orientation. And it's the idea that we would award a contract or service for a particular item, maybe even a category, to one particular supplier rather than multiple suppliers that we can uh, cause to compete against one another. You know, if I'm a company that makes a lot of what we sell or that is capable of making a lot of what we sell, I might be more oriented toward a competitive relationship. But if I'm more of an integrator that buys most of what I sell, then I might want to cooperate with my suppliers so that their expertise comes into the product in a way that's reliable. Using sole sourcing results in a reduction in variation in and so it can be seen as something that's very beneficial toward quality, and especially in a situation where the integrator, the manufacturer, doesn't have a lot of expertise in that area where we're buying. So when I buy, I'm not just getting a product, I'm getting expertise. So, we may have a competitive orientation or a cooperative orientation, or it may vary according to the supply category that we're looking at. We need to have a strategy in this regard. That's an important aspect of supply management. So at last we come down to buying. And when we think about buying, then we're getting pretty close to actually executing the relationship in terms of nuts and bolts. And so a lot of times we can be assisted when it comes down to the actual operation of the supply chain with artificial intelligence. For example, we might use data analysis for sourcing. So we might create preferred supplier lists by working through data that we have. Uh, we might in some way be able to identify and manage the risk that we're facing by accurately identifying or seeing sudden changes in what we're getting in what's happening in a market, something of that nature. And really, we think about robots in terms of moving things physically, but robotic process automation, RPA, could be used to streamline tasks that are repetitive tasks involved in buying. So, checking things into inventory that a supplier has sent, for example, issuing a payment, for example, uh, providing an invoice, for example. These are things that RPA might be able to assist us with. Obviously, in today's world, we don't really want to do a lot of our transactions with uh, paper processes, and so we're going to be using e-purchasing. Some of the things that we do in that regard would be electronic data interchange, essentially for standard and routine business documents. There's really no reason to transfer them in any way other than online. So we're going to exchange data electronically. We're not going to place phone calls or things of that nature. When someone has shipped a shipment of something that we have under contract, they're not going to call us and tell us, okay, it'll be there tomorrow. We'll use electronic data interchange for those sorts of things. Catalog hubs are basically a situation where suppliers uh, post a portfolio of things they're able to offer on the internet, and buyers select and buy what they want, and it happens electronically. So, you guys know what that is. You've seen it with something like, we could even say, Amazon.com. Exchanges are more like electronic marketplaces. So you'll have buying and selling firms in that type of a scenario where uh, it makes it a lot easier to do business and conduct negotiations and things of that nature, particularly in situations where you're not going to be really close to the supplier in a sole supplier relationship. And auctions and reverse auctions, these are situations where we have a marketplace enabling competitive bidding for things to be bought or things to be sold. So basically, in today's world, we're going to approach the supplier relationship thing to the extent we can with electronic automation tools. The last aspect of supplier relationship management that your book deals with is VMI. So vendor managed inventory is a system in which the supplier essentially, uh, well, like it says, manages the inventory. So, for example, we may actually have in our manufacturing plant a dedicated space that our supplier uses to keep materials. And when we need the materials, they provide them without any purchase or anything of that nature. And basically, the inventory, work in process inventory, and raw materials inventory that we need is available in the plant, and it's the vendor that let's just say we're talking about a engine assembler, and that engine assembler needs a particular type of hydraulic hose, and the hose supplier, the vendor, keeps track of how much we're making, how much we have, where it is and make sure we never have a difficulty with hoses. We don't even think about hoses, the hydraulic hoses. The vendor manages that inventory. So what we have is collaboration based on trust, potentially cost savings. We don't even have to think about it. It simplifies the management from the purchaser's perspective. And generally, what we're going to be experiencing is a better customer service in the context of an agreement. Uh, Instead of a purchase order, we have a written agreement, a relationship with our supplier. Going beyond the obvious competitive aspects of the supplier relationship, we may be, from an ethical perspective, concerned about the ways that our supply chain looks. And so we may seek some sort of a certification of the supply chain in order to ensure that we're doing things in an ethical way. SA 8000 is one particular standard that could be used in order to address those types of issues in the supplier relationship. So when it comes down to it, talking about supply management, this is the end of our section on that. There are a wide range of things that we might be concerned with and monitoring supplier performance with and attempting to manage in the supply base. And so on-time deliveries, lead times, quality, cost, inventory levels and component availability, collaboration, waste elimination, environmental issues, ethical issues. All of these are performance measures that might be important to being competitive and managing our suppliers. So changing gears from supplier management to the order fulfillment process, uh, here we go. So the order fulfillment process essentially is what's between our suppliers and our customers. So it's determining what kind of demand we're going to satisfy, making sure that parts are arriving on time and being used and showing up in the quality and quantity that are needed to be used, and then producing and shipping the parts. So, this is essentially the order cycle. You take an order, you get the part, you make what was ordered, and you ship it. And this kind of fleshes that out a little bit more. So customer demand planning decides how much and what are we going to have available for customers. Supply planning makes sure that we have the materials we need in order to satisfy the customer demand. Production then executes uh, that supply plan to produce what's needed based on the availability of supply. It's not our intent really here to teach a course on logistics, but there's a lot involved in the process of getting the finished goods to a customer. And a company's going to have to decide if they're going to own the logistical resources themselves or if they're going to buy those services from someone else. And maybe they'll use a third party logistics provider of some kind. They're going to have to decide where to keep some of their inventory and resources and warehouses and things of that nature. There's going to have to be decisions about the mode. And so is it truck, train, ship, pipeline, airplane? How are we going to transport the items that we're delivering to a customer? How much capacity do we need in the logistical system? And are we going to package products to be shipped directly or shipped through some sort of LTL system that's going to require uh, the ability to sort through and ship through intermediate warehouses? So there's a lot involved in logistics, obviously, and a key aspect of the order fulfillment process. We could do real well in identifying demand, customer demand management, forecasting. We could do real well in supply management, and then do real well in production, make exactly what's needed when it's needed, have it ready, and then it could all fall apart with logistics. So we have to be careful to manage this aspect as well. To wrap up, then, just like with the supplier management processes, order fulfillment process has a number of potential performance measures. So things like what's the percent of incomplete orders that we ship? What percent of orders are we shipping on time? What are our lead times? What are our quality levels? What's our cost look like? Are customers satisfied? To what extent? How much inventory are we using? And what's the environmental impact of what we're doing? Are there security issues that we have not effectively addressed? So, wide range of performance measures we might consider with an order fulfillment process. Well, the last aspect of this chapter deals with the customer relationship process. This really addresses the interface between the firm and its customers in the supply chain. So it's kind of the downstream aspect of supply chain management. It has to do with things like marketing, how customers place their orders with us, and how we handle customer service issues. A lot of this would be taught in a marketing course, and so this is a relatively short part of the chapter. So we know about marketing. Essentially, this determines the customers we're going to target, how we're going to target them, and of course the 5 Ps, things like product, price, promotion, place, and so on. Electronic commerce from a supply chain perspective is a big deal when we think about how the supply chain facilitates effective marketing. And so we may be using software, B2B or B2C type systems to facilitate the application and exchange of information and communication in the supply chain when we're thinking about customers. So order placement has to do with how we get the information that's needed to execute a sale, so that we know what it is the customer wants, when they want it, what the service level is, what the quality levels are, what the price is, and so that we can track the order until the customer actually receives that. And again, this may be something that's facilitated electronically. And then customer service has to do with how do we respond when customers have issues? How do we resolve problems and provide the information that our customers need? Yeah, I mean, lots of times it's an 800 number with uh, some sort of a bot that works through a tree before we ever get to speak with some sort of customer service agent who may or may not be effective and may or may not be able to answer our question. So it's an important aspect that from an experiential perspective, a customer that needs service is often frustrated. And then the systems we use to provide that service often further frustrate the customer. And so this is an area where a lot of firms have a lot of opportunity to make improvements. Again, performance measures in this area might have to do with the percent of orders that are taken accurately, what's the turnaround time to place an order, how satisfied is the customer with the process of placing the order, uh, and other other aspects. I believe this is the last slide. So essentially, we've said, okay, what is competitiveness in a supply chain? We've talked about supply management. We've talked about order fulfillment. And we've talked about customer relationship processes. That's kind of a overview, upstream, the focal firm, and downstream view of what supply chain management entails. Hope you found it helpful in some way.